what I wanted to do, as Mark says, is to talk a little bit now, today, about the relevance of England, the idea of England, and also the reality of it, as I see it, to your situation here in America, and the situation of all of us in the emerging political climate. It's very obvious that not only that terrorism has completely changed people's perspective on world politics, but also that it has brought home to many people who didn't see the truth before that globalization is not necessarily an unmitigated good, and that countries who had stuck together through alliance in the old situation might not be appropriate allies in the new. And this is beginning to be very obvious, I think, to Americans, that their relationship with Europe, which was reasonably clear under the threat of the Cold War, has had to be revised in the wake of the terrorist attacks and in the wake of the growing discontent in the Muslim world with what we would regard as the Western settlement. So there's a real question, I think, in all American minds as to what is the relationship today between America, the United States of America, and Europe, and also a real question in your minds and in my mind too as to what is the relation between Britain, my country, and Europe. And there's a further question, which is the one that I begin by discussing, which is what is the relation between England, which is my real country, and the Britain of current everyday politics. Now, in my book, I set forth a particular vision of England as a country which has no real parallel in the modern world, since it is founded upon loyalty to a specific place. It's not a loyalty, for example, such as is familiar from continental Europe, based on an idea of nationhood. We English don't see ourselves as a nation in the way that the French do, or the Germans did at a crucial moment in their history, nor do we see ourselves as defined by a common religion. And indeed, religious membership is something that we regard as on the margins from the point of view of political loyalty. Nor do we think of ourselves as a kind of corporation, which many Americans seem to think of themselves as. We think of ourselves as bound together by our residence in a particular place. And this place, England, is not defined for us by the race that inhabits it. We don't have a racial idea of our country, nor, as I say, by the nation which has been which it has produced. It's defined for us as a kind of home, and that's part of our history, that it has taken on this character. We are obviously, or have been, a seafaring nation, sorry, a seafaring people who have come home to our country and regarded that place as the place where we belong. And it's this idea of belonging that I try to define in my book. England is first and foremost for us a home, and its institutions are the institutions which are appropriate to a home. And I think this is how we should understand, in particular, the English conception of law, which we passed on to you. The English law, as I see it, is defined as a law of the land. It's the law which obtains in that particular territory, in our home, like the rules which are obtained inside a particular person's house, and the rules which he and his family intrinsically and instinctively obey, and which visitors are expected to obey too. Likewise with us, the law is not something defined by some abstract system like the civilian code of Roman law. It's a law which is there in the landscape, which has to be discovered by the judges, but which has been there from time immemorial and will always be there. And this was affirmed in 1066 at the conquest, when William I was accepted as monarch only on condition that he vowed to uphold the law of the land, the law as it already was inscribed, so to speak, in the fields and towns of England. And the conqueror did uphold the law of the land, which was that system of law which came to be known in due course as common law. Common meaning it's common to the whole land in which it was applied. This common law was not something written down. Even today, it is not actually written down as a system of law. Various judgments have been written down, and those judgments have become authoritative for our judges. And that's the nature of the common law, that it proceeds from judgment to judgment. But in itself, if you wanted to know quite what it is, you would have to say that it is that law which pertains over the land of England. Interestingly enough, it is not the same as the law which pertains over the land of Scotland, although it does apply to Wales. Scotland has its own jurisdiction, which is a Roman law jurisdiction, itself much influenced by the English, of course, but with many things in common with continental systems. Whereas the common law is that law which has been, as it were, extracted by judges from their reflection upon the government which prevails in the land of England. So it's a law defined in terms of the land and the people who live in it. Now, I say a lot in my book about the nature of the common law, and it's a fascinating topic which all Americans are also fascinated by, because it's ultimately their system of law too. Although you have a written constitution, you still have those important doctrines that define the common law, in particular the doctrine which of stare decisis, which says that a decision, once arrived at, is authoritative for all subsequent decisions until overruled by a higher court. And one of the features of the common law is that the judge discovers what the law is, case by case. When confronted with a difficulty that needs to be legally resolved, he will discover what the law is by reflecting on the facts of the case. So the common law is always very sensitive to the concrete details of human life, and is imbued, therefore, with a record of the history of the land in which it applies. Now, I would argue that one of the most important characteristics of the English, namely their individualism, the fact that they regard their own lives as their responsibility and also their right to lead as they will, I would regard this as in part a common law creation. It's because they don't live under a system of edicts, of laws laid down from on high, but rather regard law as something which is discovered in the very land in which they conduct their lives. It's because of that they regard themselves as having the freedom to develop as individuals in their own particular way. And English individualism has always been noticed by visitors to our country, and has always been relied upon by government in our country to solve the problems which government is in the general business of creating. And this individualism obviously was transported here and has perhaps its last home in the world in this country. There's another consequence also of the common law jurisdiction, which is that it makes possible what I call a society of strangers. We are very different, the English, from the Italians and the Spaniards, for example, in that we live side by side in neighbourhoods, but seldom speak to each other. And yet in times of need and emergencies, we are much more inclined to help our neighbours than are, for example, neighbours in Mediterranean countries, who nevertheless chatted to each other all day. This is a remarkable feature, that this society of strangers nevertheless is a society based on complete mutual trust, which I think has something to do with the underlying sense that the law prevails. The law is inscribed in the land and will always be there, and we can always be trusted to it can always be trusted to solve our problems. And you can trust strangers when you are both law-abiding for the very reason that the law will settle any dispute between you. So trust grows between strangers in the common law jurisdiction and enables them to go on to continue being strangers and still nevertheless trusting each other. We don't rely upon warm relations of family and friendship in the way that many Mediterranean communities do. Right, so That means that some of the most important characteristics of the English are bound up with this conception of law, which distinguishes us from all other countries in Europe, with the exception of Denmark and Norway, which do retain some of the common law jurisdiction also, Denmark in particular. And it's interesting that Denmark and England are the only two countries which have had more than 2 centuries of continuous peaceful government in Europe. And although Denmark suffered the misfortune of being overrun by the Germans in the last war, it has, apart from that episode, maintained the same kind of equilibrium as the English over the centuries of modernization. And I think this, again, is a proof of the uniqueness of the common law and its ability to solve the new problems in new circumstances, which older systems of law, other systems of law, have not been able to do. Interestingly, it's also the Danes who have joined the English, the Danes and the Norwegians who've joined the English in essentially repudiating the European Union, although our political leadership won't allow us to do this. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, so what we have then in England is not a country defined in terms of nationalist ideas or religious ideas or corporate ideas, but a country defined in terms of a place, a land, and the law which prevails in it. It is a country seen as a home. And the importance of a home is, of course, that it is a place where you are safe, where you don't have to disturb your own routines. You don't have to make the kind of compromises that you would have to elsewhere. You can live side by side with people to whom you never speak, and so on. And this endows the English land with a kind of enchantment, which is recognised famously in the speech which you all know from Shakespeare, in which he describes England as this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings. Shakespeare in his history plays set out to describe this kind of enchantment of the landscape which comes about through the English way of settling it. And this means that our society has been one in which has been rich in small institutions, in little platoons, as Burke called them, and in voluntary activities which bring people together in the form of clubs, churches, societies, schools, and so on. And the English, on the whole, in my experience, have found clubs far more easy to relate to than people. That's to say that by joining a club, they can remain on distant terms with each other, but nevertheless have the consolation of society. And I think this is one of the reasons why you find so many of these small organizations which have their own rituals, their own ceremonies, their own pride, and generate their own loyalty in England and also in America, as Tocqueville noticed. And you don't find them, for example, to the same extent at least, in France or Italy or in the Mediterranean generally. The English, because of this way of relating to each other, are, as everybody knows, very easily embarrassed and maintain a state of more or less semi-permanent embarrassment towards each other. And that, again, is part of the society of strangers. Embarrassment is not necessarily something painful. It's something which, it's a way in which distance is constantly recreated. By being embarrassed, you move yourself backwards from somebody. This is why when an English person is knocked over in the street by some passing fanatic, he will get up and apologize. Because the apology recreates the distance. You know, a Mediterranean person in such circumstances would get up and fight. But fighting is a kind of intimacy. It creates a relationship and destroys the the wall that otherwise keeps people apart from each other. So I think many of the features that people have observed, the curious features of the English, stem from this society of strangers that they've tried to create together. And one of the most important symbols of this is our national sport of cricket, which was corrupted here to baseball, which is in many ways the complete opposite of cricket. Cricket is a sedate game which occurs on village greens in pristine white uniforms, as though it were a movement a ballet among angels. There is no sense of sweat or exertion. Every now and then there's a smack of a ball against a bat, but nobody is able to see where it has gone. Somebody vaguely moves to one side to catch it, and then embarrassedly walks forward to confess that he's achieved something. But the whole thing has a kind of subdued character, and even the applause is very muted, and only afterwards over tea can you say that it wasn't such a bad game after all. So that kind of thing, which was obviously a symbol of our particular way of enjoying each other's company, has very little parallel outside the country. Though interestingly enough, certain parts of the empire, cricket caught on partly as a way for the locals to show that they too, however much they had to amend their ways to do so, were capable of achieving this symbolic expression of embarrassed remoteness. And the Pakistanis have done it brilliantly. So, this out of this embarrassed quality grows the famous eccentricity of the English, an eccentricity which I might say is rapidly disappearing, as of course it's bound to under the impact of the mass media and so on. The mass media vulgarize everything and focus upon the lowest common denominator, but that lowest common denominator is not an eccentric in the old traditional English way. It's not someone who is keeping himself to himself and not interested in other person's opinions. On the contrary, it's someone who's trying to debase himself to be acceptable, so as not to be a threat to people at the bottom of the social order. That is something which, that's a new thing which has been brought in by reality TV and such things, which of course is wiping out the eccentricity of the English very rapidly. John Stuart Mill famously said that eccentricity should not be seen as a vice, but on the contrary, as one of the principal forms of social virtue. It's the way in which new ideas protect themselves from opposition and long enough to become something more than merely intimations, so as to become genuine contributions to the fund of human knowledge. Right, well, just a few more things about the English conception of law and authority before I move on. The common law system, as I said, is founded on the idea that the judge discerns in the particular case what is the rule of law that will resolve it. That rule of law may not have ever been set down in words before. The whole idea of a leading case in law is that it's usually the first time that the judge has actually stated the rule of law, but he's not stating it as something newly invented, but rather as something that has always existed, but he is discovering. Now, that's not the only interesting feature of the common law, however. More interesting is the idea of a remedy. The common law exists not to lay down the requirements of the sovereign power, not to give edicts which all the people must obey. Its primary function is to provide a remedy to somebody who has suffered some damage or some injustice. And this search for remedies is the crucial defining feature, in a way, of our legal system, and it's what has made American law so creative an instrument in developing the American economy, at least until, obviously, the litigation explosion of recent years. This search for a remedy is in a way the opposite of the continental idea of law as imposing the sovereign edicts on the people. What the search for a remedy is an individual's attempt to gain the help of the sovereign power in resolving and appeasing his own misfortune. And that is produces a particular kind of law, one which is most obviously manifest in the law of tort, in which the individual subject, the individual person, is more important in deciding what the law has to do than the sovereign power himself or itself. The sovereign is being called into the help, into the aid of the individual subject, but is not himself taking the initiative in creating or resolving the legal problem. And this led, in the Middle Ages, of course, to the very famous procedure of appeal through the Court of Chancery to the sovereign, and the development of what is known as the maxims of equity and the doctrine of equity and equitable jurisdiction. Now, this is all very technical, I know, but one result of this, which you're all familiar with, is the concept of the trust. In English law, there can be special relations discerned by the judge, which are relations of trust between people, and these are relations which create social facts outside the jurisdiction, outside the dictatorship, rather, of the sovereign himself. And the law of trust has been perhaps the most creative aspect of English law in giving protection to all the little platoons, all those little clubs and institutions that I referred to earlier. What the law of trust has enabled us to do is to get together and create things like this institution, ISI, here, without getting the consent of anybody else. People just get together and they do it. You can't do that under the Code Napoleon or the German system. You can't just get together and say that we now have an institution which holds funds for us in common and which has the following purposes. You can do that in the English law because it's no business of the sovereign that you've done it. You're just declaring yourself trustees. Right, so this means that autonomous institutions have been really all important in developing the political and social aspect of my country and also of this country too. Autonomous institutions like private universities, private schools, private clubs, sports and associations, orchestras, theatres, you name it, anything in which ordinary human beings find their social relief and satisfaction. These have, on the whole, have been created by private initiative in the past, and only in recent years have been colonized by the state, usually to their disadvantage. Indeed, in my country, the two great universities of Oxford and Cambridge, which set the standard for European education from the Renaissance onwards, were entirely a result of private initiatives and developed their statutes and their corporate identity without any particular reference to the Crown, although we were eventually given royal charters to guarantee them. But those royal charters were a recognition of an already existing fact. Unfortunately, in recent years, these universities have very foolishly come to depend upon the state for their funds and are now being forced to do the will of the state, which, of course, is these days to abolish education and put equalization in its place. So you won't see many more achievements from the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. One of the two features of the English character which have emerged from this kind of institution building, I think, three features deserve special mention. One is the hostility of the, English people generally and of English ways of deciding things in particular to the idea of rational principles. The English don't like rationality as defined by, at least by the French. The idea that there should be a first principle in something from which the solution to a question is derived by logic or whatever reasoning doesn't appeal to them. This doesn't mean that they don't like things to be reasonable. On the contrary, they believe that a reasonable person is someone who is not strictly rational. He's someone who has, to be reasonable is to negotiate, to compromise, to adjust your purposes in the light of other people's disagreement with them. It means finding a shared solution about which you can agree, even if it's not the one that you ideally would have wanted. And that, I think that English idea of reasonableness, which again has much in common with the English law, is something which is deeply antipathetic to the French Cartesian idea of the rational solution, where the first principles define what must be accepted, and solutions are derived by deduction from those principles. This means that the English often especially to the French, seem muddled. It looks as though they're just improvising their way through life and are actually being totally irrational, when they are, in fact, being much more reasonable, because they recognize that your goals cannot be specified in advance. You exist in a society of strangers. Your purpose, if you have a purpose, is to get through the day without having had any intimate contact with them. And that means making as many compromises as are necessary to find a joint solution. So, similarly, another consequence is the spirit of fair play. This is much commented on in my youth. Fair play was what sports were there to generate in people. Fair play was what you really learned in the playground, and so on. Fair play simply means recognizing that it's not for you to determine whether you are acting rightly or wrongly. It's for an impartial judge always to do this. And you must behave as though the impartial judge always had a place in your dealings with other people. And I think that that gives rise to this particular spirit, the spirit of fair play, whereby an individual looks on himself as only one player in the game, no more important than any other, someone who's as much subordinated to the impartial judge as the person he's playing with or competing with, and so on. And I think this is very true of business as it was conducted in the City of London, and as it is conducted in the ordinary small-town America today. That the principle of fair play does dominate people's understanding of what they're doing. Finally, connected with that, there is this ethic of duty. Now, I was brought up in this ethic, which is sort of often mocked today, the Boy Scout ethic, that you must do your duty, first of all, because that is the thing that others expect of you. And maybe it's true that it's now disappearing from the world, this idea that duty takes precedence over everything. But nevertheless, I think you will find that most of our recent history has emphasized the idea of duty before all other things, that there are duties towards your fellows, your family, your school, your club, whatever institution that you're involved with, which take precedence over any interest of your own. And this gives rise, I think, to this virtue called public spirit, which is not, of course, a purely English thing, which the Romans were famous for possessing, and also the citizens of Athens, if Pericles' speech in Thucydides is to be believed. Public spirit is the disposition to put the general well-being in front of your own interests. And that is something which I think the English certainly had. It's what enabled them to build all the institutions that they built, and it's something which the Americans have inherited from them. This is perhaps the last country in the world where it still exists, indeed, where people will, for instance, give a vast amount of their income to a cause that they believe in. something like an institution like ISI could never arise in France. Nobody would think of giving the money required to build it. But here in America, most people feel, if they've received any benefits from society at all, that they have, in some sense, an obligation to pay them back. And they do that by engaging in good works of the kind that this society exemplifies. So I think that that is something which certainly the English had and which they passed on to the Americans and which has made both of our countries quite distinct in the modern world. Now, I haven't talked in this talk about the English religion, although I think you all will recognise that this is, again, something quite peculiar to our country, which, again, we've passed on to yours. England has still an established church, which is supposed to be a Protestant church, in that it doesn't recognise the authority of Rome, but it describes itself in its liturgy as Catholic. And it has a head. That head is the Queen. And it has it believes in the apostolic succession, which in some way Henry VIII managed to capture, so he thought, from the line of popes. Given the nature of the popes of his day, it is not difficult to believe that Henry VIII was equally entitled to declare himself the apostolic successor. But nevertheless, this seemed plausible at the time, and it has remained, this peculiar compromise has remained in the heart of our religion, and the Anglican Church describes itself as the Church of England. Interestingly, the Church in England described itself as the Church of England from the very earliest Middle Ages, even before the break with the papacy. It was always the case that the Church regarded itself in the way that the law of England regards itself as a feature of the landscape. And then, of course, it translated itself over here, but only after the nonconformist and protesting churches which it had given rise to had got here first. But what you have as a result, and this is condensing an awful lot of history into a few sentences, is a constellation of Christian churches which cater for all possible tastes by effectively making religion also an object of the same embarrassment as everything else. Again, it's something you don't talk about. It's something which is part of your life, but nevertheless to be protected from the curious eyes of strangers. And you take your choice among the various churches available to you. And as long as you are dutifully worship God in your own way, and as long as you don't make too much of a fuss about who or what God is, you will get along perfectly well with your neighbours, and the result will be a Christian community in the best sense of the word, which is a community based on forgiveness towards your fellow human beings. What you actually believe and why is much less important than the fact that you conform to the orthodox Christian morality. And that, I think, has been a very positive thing in the history of America, because it's enabled communities gradually to, while retaining a religious identity, to set religion quietly to one side and proceed with the business of living on terms with people with whom they might very well disagree if they made the mistake of knowing them any better. So, going back to England, however, my particular worries about England, it's quite obvious that what I've been describing is a historical settlement, so to speak, which no longer has the full endorsement of the people who live under it, and which is being subjected to major forces from outside and from inside, which it doesn't have the obvious resources to deal with. There are three very important such forces. The first is the internal fragmentation of our country. England was originally, when I was born, the centre of an empire which was the largest that the world has ever known, but which, partly as a result of 2 world wars, partly as a result of your President Wilson and his followers, it was in the process of giving away. Losing the empire meant that there was no clear reason why the English, the Scots, the Welsh and the Northern Irish, or the Irish originally, should regard themselves as joining in a common enterprise. The common enterprise of building and maintaining and governing that empire held together these communities in a way which nothing since has been able to do. And in particular, the Celtic fringe of my country, the Welsh, Northern Irish and Scots, have found themselves in well, not exactly a false position, but a position that can't easily be understood vis-à-vis England. And they have effectively broken away to have their own parliaments and so on. This was also a deliberate gesture on the part of the Labour Party under Tony Blair, by giving the Scots a parliament of their own, but making sure that they also had the right to sit in the Parliament of Westminster. He ensured that he had this anti-English vote permanently in the House of Commons, while also not having to do anything to appease the Scots' desire for a country of their own. Were Scotland really to be an independent country, and Wales likewise, then there would be a permanent Conservative government in England. And of course Tony Blair didn't want that. So there's been a huge constitutional muddle as a result of all this. We don't really know anymore whether England is the centre of Britain, or whether Britain is a genuine entity, what the relation is between England and Scotland. The English are not allowed to have a parliament of their own, even though the Scots and the Welsh have theirs. And the whole political understanding of my country has been thrown into doubt by what I think of as quite needless and maybe even destructive political reforms. Then, of course, there's been the massive immigration into our country of communities which don't acquire a loyalty to it. They're not integrated. You in America have this wonderful loyalty creating process whereby new arrivals are integrated into the sense of national cohesion. Maybe it's, this is controversial for you too, but nevertheless, there is no doubt that people here, within one generation, identify themselves as American. And to some extent, those who came to England from the old empire identify themselves at least as British, though they find some difficulty in identifying themselves as English. But there are serious danger signs, not only in my country, of course, but throughout Europe, that we are now undergoing waves of immigration from countries where the idea of having a loyalty to a place, and especially to the law of the land, is such a weird idea that it won't take hold. Loyalty for our incoming Muslims is, for the most part, loyalty to the Islamic Ummah, in other words, to the faith, not to the country where you are. In France, this is now proving really dangerous. Finally, there is the process of European integration, which has effectively confiscated our lawmaking powers and is imposing upon us a jurisdiction which is structurally incompatible with the common law. The odd thing is that our politicians have all, without any real exception, even Mrs. Thatcher, have gone along with this process, have not taken the opportunities that they might have had to either to resist it or to reverse it, but have allowed the gradual cancellation of our indigenous institutions by these unanswerable bureaucracies in Brussels and Strasbourg. And this is, in conclusion, brings me to what I want to say today. There is a question in our mind and in your mind as to what the relation now is between America and Britain on the one hand, and England in particular, and America and Europe on the other hand. What should the attitude of America be, both to the new Europe and to the old England that is being gradually buried somewhere beneath it? Now, I would say that we must always remember what we have in common. That it's not just that we have language and history in common, though this is incredibly important, but we also have in common this whole legal inheritance that I've been referring to, the common law and all that goes with it. We have in common this constellated collection of Christian churches and the idea of religion that comes from that. We also have in common, of course, the democratic tradition, which enables us to see the common man as something more than just a common man, but as the individual on whom the political order rests. And coming out of that, we share this idea that society should be created by voluntary action and public spirit, and not imposed by decrees from the state. And these are really important things that we have in common, which I think do distinguish us to a great extent from the European inheritance, the continental inheritance of Europe, which is gaining dominance through the European process. So that, for instance, when there is a crisis such as occurred recently over Iraq, and it looks like that there is a job to be done, the old English idea that, if there is a job to be done, it's you who have to do it, is one that the Americans feel and the British feel too, and we tend to join together in this, which is, whereas you will find, and increasingly you will find this, the Europeans will withdraw and stand back and let it all happen. And since it's in a time of crisis that real relationships become clear, I think we can see that the Iraq War is one that did show where the real relationship lies. And again, because in both of us have this deep respect for the idea of impartial justice, we have, as a result, a supreme distrust of law which is politicized. Law which is made, instead of being an instrument of justice, becomes an instrument of policy. For instance, the law that's administered by people who have set out to impose a particular political vision and a political goal by means of law is something which we find deeply suspicious. So that, for instance, legal solutions envisaged by the United Nations or the European Court of Human Rights or the European Union itself, these for us are not really solutions stemming from an idea of justice. They are solutions which stem from a political purpose, a political program, which is using law as an excuse for imposing what is in fact a single-minded liberal agenda. And I think that American suspicions of the United Nations are also suspicions that the English ought to share, and to some extent do share. But the problem is that we have now been absorbed by this European process, which grew out of hostility to the nationalist fervour of Germany and the nationalist ideologies which tore Europe apart in 2 world wars. It grew out of that, but it has taken as its target not just nationalism, which I think is a dangerous thing, at least in its extreme forms, but also this perfectly legitimate and indeed extremely positive thing, which is the sense of being at home in a particular place and making that place yours, which is what we, the English, have done and what you, the Americans, have done, and what the European Union doesn't like us doing. Even though we're completely non-ideological about it, nevertheless, we're confronted with a barrage of legislation which has the abolition of England as one of its goals. Indeed, the official maps of Europe don't contain a place called England. They have 4 regions, but neither of them bear the word England in their name. This is we're unique indeed I think in the European Union in not being allowed to have our name. And the reason is obvious, namely resentment of the fact that we alone won the last war. All the rest were conquered or destroyed. Anyway, we're in that situation, and we have to do something about it. And my view is that the best thing for us to do is to extricate ourselves, if we can, from the process of European Union, and join with the American, some kind of American system, not necessarily economically, but to maintain this alliance and recognise that although we are no longer a great power in Europe, that in conjunction with you, we will be the great power that we always were, namely you, what remains of the British Empire. Although, of course, you've rejected the crown, nevertheless, almost everything else is intact. And I think this is something that English conservatives ought to work on as the salvation for their particular philosophy, because it's only here in this country that philosophy still has some hopes of political power. On the other hand, we are, as I say, we're subjected to the European process, and you can see the problem if you look at the character of Tony Blair. There is somebody who, in the emergency that the West confronted after the terrorist attacks on America, immediately threw in his lot with America. That was the instinctive English reaction. But when it comes to the European process, faced with this incredible 200-page document called a European Constitution, instead of pointing out the fact that it is no such thing, that's a piece of meaningless gobbledygook which will be an excuse for taking away what remains of our political liberties, he enthusiastically endorses it and says that the future of our country depends upon saying yes to it. With any luck, the French will say no, and since it's they who invented it, we will have escaped from the problem. But nevertheless, this shows the deep schizophrenia which is now prevailing in Europe, that, and in my country in particular, that it knows in its emotional part that it belongs with you, but nevertheless it has this intellectual part which has thought of itself as part of Europe, and is prepared to accept anything that the European Union requires in order to maintain its membership. And I think that is one of the deep problems that we must now confront. So, thank you. Gosh, phew, I needed that.